Continuing our reading in The World and Thorinn by Damon Knight. Today is Chapter 5, Section 2. At length the passage widened into a greater darkness. Thorinn stepped out into it cautiously, found himself in a narrow cavern half choked with a pile of fallen stones. Beyond, in the far wall, he saw a jagged opening. He climbed the heap of stones and peered in. Light glimmered back from objects whose forms he could not make out. A breath of air came from the opening, but it was slow and stale. He hesitated a moment, then climbed through the gap in the wall and dropped to the level floor below. Silence pressed in upon his ears, a silence more profound even than that of the passage behind him. On every side stood massive objects piled one on another, with slender rods between them. The floor he stood on was perfectly level and as smooth as ice. It was not stone, but some gray, greasy material, which seemed faintly warm to the touch. The air was dry and warm. The huge columns stood in rows, their tops disappeared in the darkness. Thorinn moved between the columns, touching them curiously as he passed. The rods of cold metal supported racks on which were piled bundles and bales and other things for which Thorinn had no names, all covered with some cool, water-smooth substance. He began to realize that he must be in some troll's storehouse, and he paused, listening, but the silence was unbroken. He slid his hands curiously around one of the bundles. It was so smooth and heavy that it was hard to find any purchase on it, but he dragged it out at last and lowered it to the floor. It was almost as broad as his arms could span, vaguely oblong, but with all its corners rounded, like a huge gray cheese. He looked in vain for any seam or opening. The smooth surface was unbroken. Next he tried to cut it with his sword. At the first touch, the covering opened like a mouth. Thorinn put his fingers under the edges, marveling at the thinness and transparency of the stuff, finer than the skin of an onion. He pulled, and the tear lengthened easily. The covering split and tore without resistance, and he peeled it off in great rustling sheets. Underneath was a gray, soft substance like bread dough. He could push it in, but the hollow filled out again at once, nor could he tear it with his fingers. Again he used the sword. The gray stuff cut readily, but would not tear like the other. When he pried at the gash he had made, sticky-looking fibers of the bottom clung stubbornly together. He slashed deeper, and at last it gave way, opening in a slit, as the transparent stuff had done, and he saw something else beneath it, a gleam of russet and gold. He tore away the gray substance in lumps, threw them aside. In the glow of his light box, a bundle of stuff was revealed, and he caught his breath. Rich and soft beyond belief it was, russet and gold and scarlet in shimmering patterns that were not printed on the fabric but woven into it. He unfolded and unwrapped the cloth, spreading it out on the floor as it went. It covered the whole width of the aisle, and still there was more. Thorinn dropped it and stared at it in wonder. Such a piece of stuff was beyond price. He could ask what he liked for it. This one bale had made him rich, and all the others? He attacked a second bundle, found it contained another cloth like the first, covered in a deep purple, royal blue, peacock green. In a fury of excitement, he ran to the next aisle, found a sack of smaller bundles, some of which, no bigger than his head, had fallen to the floor. He chose one, slashed it open. Inside was a glittering device of brass and ebony, evidently a magical instrument. Such things he knew could injure any man not schooled in their use, and he laid it respectfully aside. The next was a pretty jug with a handle and a spout to pour from. He tilted it to see why it was so heavy, but only a single drop of moisture came out. The next was black and red patterned box, in which, nested in purple velvet, lay dozens of tiny bright figurines of men and ladies. Stunned with joy, he ran to the next aisle and found another magical engine. The next, yen metal knives smaller than his finger, with tiny blades as sharp as his sword. The next, hammers, wedges, no bigger than the knives, and other tiny tools whose use he could not imagine. The fever to open more and yet more bundles made him forget weariness, cold, thirst, and hunger. He found clothing, wide-skirted robes heavy with brocade, tunics with breeks of gossamer stuff, shoes marvelously thin and supple. He found rings, bracelets, ropes of jewels that spilled in a flood across the floor, riches piled up around him, and still he knew that he had barely begun. Once he paused long enough to gather all his trove into a place, and sorting through it, tried to decide what he would take with him. Then the blank gray faces of the unopened parcels drove him to frenzy again, and against all common sense, he attacked bundles larger than any he had yet opened, gray oblongs taller than himself, ripping open their fronts without removing them from the racks, merely to see what was inside. Cabinets of polished wood inlaid with knockery, huge engines of metal and glass, chairs with arms like curved serpents, more bales of cloth 10 times larger than the others. Then, for weariness alone, he forbore, and sat with his head on his heavy arms. Hunger and thirst returned. He tipped up his wallet and drank what little water there was in it, but it was not enough. He began to think of finding some container and going back through the cavern for water. The wallet would do, but he wanted to keep that dry to hold his treasure. He could put some of the smaller things in it, the jewels perhaps, and make a bundle of the rest to carry on his back. He remembered the jug and looked for it. There it was at the edge of the great pile he had made. When he took it up, it seemed to him that it was heavier than before. He shook it, and it gurgled. Without thinking, he tipped it over. Water splashed on his feet. That is the end of section 2.